We're still waiting on a quite frankly obscene amount of paddles to come in, but they haven't yet, so in the meantime, we're going to do a bit of a comparison today. Unfortunately, I picked up a bit of a knock to my ankle a couple weeks ago. I was sliding for the ball, as I love to do, but my shoe was a little too worn, so my ankle twisted a bit too much, so now I gotta take a little bit of time off. So we won't be doing a full-on review this week. Instead, we're going to be directly comparing the 3 thermoform paddles I've tested so far. That's to say the Ben John's Perseus 16, the Vatic Pro V7, and the CRBN1X Power 16mm. Like really, could I have picked these paddles up in a more awkward way? No. Please remember that any of the paddles we mention here you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you like our content, and let me know down in the comment section down below what paddle you want me to review or what paddles you want me to compare next. Anyways, back to the paddles. These are the 3 thermoform paddles that I have tried, and each one performed astonishingly well in important metrics. The CRBN1X Power was the first real shock to the system because it was the first thermoform paddle that I tried, and I couldn't believe the amount of power, spin, and connectedness I had with the ball. I was equally in love with the V7 and the Perseus, but after quite a bit more time playing with these paddles, my analysis goes a bit deeper than, wow, I love thermoforming, and I've got a better understanding as to the nuance between the 3. It's kind of hard to compare thermoform paddles to the rest of the industry because they are so different, so it's important to compare them to each other, and there actually are some key differences between these 3. Today we'll take a look at spin, power, control, touch, sweet spot size, and discuss which of these 16mm thermoform paddles might be better for specific shots. Let's get into it. We're going to start off with spin because to me it's the most impressive aspect of a thermoform paddle. They're obviously very powerful as well, but spin adds an element of skill gap that wasn't necessarily there before. You can only generate spin with proper technique, and because thermoform paddles have raised the bar for spin potential, they reward players who have worked hard to develop that technique. It's great because for a guy like me who comes from a tennis background and can generate spin but struggles a little bit with the more soft touch side of things, I now have more of an out when I get backed into a corner. Instead of needing to hit that inch perfect drop shot to reset the point, thermoform paddles allow me to hit that high spin, low dipping passing shot to take control of the point. But not all 3 of these paddles are created equal in terms of spin. The CRBN1 and V7 are actually very close. They're the 2 first thermoform paddles that I tried, and they were the key to unlocking that extra spin potential in my game. That being said, I do think the V7 does just edge it. I just had a little bit more control over the amount of spin I could put on my shots with the V7. It's not like I ever felt limited with the CRBN1, but I do have to say I just felt like the ball was shooting off with a few more RPMs here, at least when I wanted it to. I don't really have any way of quantifying this. I am more so going off of feel, but yeah, I just felt more spin with the V7. These 2 really are in a tier of their own. The Perseus also has fantastic spin generating potential, but it's definitely not as high as the V7 or the CRBN1X. I didn't have the same bottomless access to spin here, so I couldn't hit the same crazy spinny passing shots, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because the reason it's not as spin friendly as the other 2 is because it's noticeably softer, and that definitely helps with its control. The big downside to playing with a thermoform paddle is that no matter the thickness, they're not going to be as good for soft, methodical control as more traditionally molded paddles. We'll get a little bit more into feel later, but thermoform paddles have this uniquely instantaneous response where the ball spends very little time in the paddle bed, which is great for power and spin, but not nearly as good for control. The V7 and CRBN1X are both very similar in terms of control. They both have that instantaneously launchy response, which means you're going to have to work on softening up your own hands, otherwise they're just going to be too launchy to be competitive in the soft game. The Carbon is ever so slightly more precise than the V7 because it has a smaller paddle face here, but that helps more with directional control on ground strokes and volleys than it does for control on resets and dinks. The Perseus, on the other hand, is much better for soft control than the other 2, and it makes sense when you think about who's endorsing it. You can control your shots with either high spin or soft control. The CRBN1 and the V7 went all in for that high spin style of control, but that's not really how Ben Johns plays. He still uses a lot of that classic pickleball touch to keep his opponents on a string, so it's no surprise that his signature paddle is a lot more on the control side of that spectrum, at least for thermoform paddles. There is a much longer dwell time on the Perseus, not quite as long as what we got on the Hyperion, but in general the control profile on this paddle is by far the best of any thermoform paddle that I've used. I also just wanted to mention that a bit of lead tape on all 3 of these will do wonders for their control profiles. Put it anywhere you want on the paddle face, but it will basically just make for a relatively softer response when you make contact with the ball. Feel is always a little bit tough to explain, but basically good feel means good feedback in your hand. When a paddle has good feel, you're going to know exactly where the ball is on the paddle face and where it's going to go when it leaves. Because there are no cutoffs in the carbon all around the paddle, the vibrations going on in the contact point here can then make their way seamlessly down the handle into your hand. The V7 has the most raw, kind of uncurated feel, which makes sense because Vatic has the least experience in manufacturing and optimizing their cores. Some of you might not like it, but I actually really do. The carbon has a much more zingy, kind of poppy feel to it. It almost feels like they added a trampoline effect in the actual honeycomb core here, so you can get even more power from the paddle. The Perseus has objectively the best and most premium feel to it. It's something that Yola has been nailing with most of their paddles, and while it's different to what it was on the Hyperion, it's still a fantastic feel. It still has that ultra responsive feel of a thermoform paddle, just with a more well-defined sweet spot and the most addictive sensation out of the three when you do make proper contact. Also, that slightly plusher feel on the Perseus definitely isn't muted or mushy in any way. It might add a little bit of dwell time, but you still have that one-to-one sensation, so really impressive from Yola there. A lot of people are super excited about the crazy amount of power thermoform paddles have, and I get it, but I just don't care as much. Power is great, don't get me wrong, but I don't really have an issue with generating pace or depth. I have more of a problem with controlling that pop, and that's why spin to me reigns supreme. That said, power is obviously fantastic with all of these, but the CRBN1X Power is clearly the most powerful. It goes back to that extra poppy sensation that I mentioned earlier. It does just add a little bit more power to your shot, and I most appreciated that on put away volleys because it just pushed them through the court with a bit more penetration. The V7 is also very powerful, but it's more so just because of the nature of thermoform paddles rather than any extra power tech in the actual paddle. Like I said, there isn't much going on in this core, so you won't get that extra manufactured bit of power, but it's still very impressive. It probably comes as no surprise because of all that extra softness I've been harping on about, but the Perseus is the least powerful of the three. Because there is more dwell time here, the ball loses a little bit of energy in the paddle face, so it isn't quite as powerful as the other two, but keep in mind that extra bit of power you're gonna get with the other two means a little bit less control, so it is a give and take. Another positive characteristic of thermoform paddles is the sweet spot size. Because the paddle and ball interaction is so rigid, and because no energy is lost in the seams because there are no seams, the sweet spot is very large and forgiving. All three of these have a big sweet spot, but it's noticeably bigger on the Carbon 1 and Perseus, again, because their cores are just a little bit farther in development than the rudimentary one that's on the V7. The V7 sweet spot is generally smaller, yes, but because the paddle is shaped a little bit more like an Invicta here, with the paddle face coming a little bit lower, it actually has a longer sweet spot. That just means that it's going to be a little bit more forgiving farther down the paddle face here. Now that longer paddle face is also why the V7 is noticeably slower than the other two. It's not as aerodynamic, so you do lose a bit of hand speed. Between the Carbon 1 and the Perseus, hand speed is literally identical. They're the same shape, they weigh the same, they have the same thickness, so you definitely won't be able to differentiate them in that way. Now they are all thick extended paddles, so they're not fast per se, but they do all have shorter counterparts if you do want a more maneuverable option. The V7 has the Flash, the Carbon 1 has the Carbon 2, and the Perseus has the Scorpius. Don't confuse the Carbon 2 with the Carbon 3 though. The Carbon 3 is the same shape as the V7. I do want to make one thing abundantly clear here is that these paddles are more similar than they are different. That being said, the differences we mentioned here today are very important playability characteristics and could be key in figuring out which will work better for your game. Obviously, the benefit to a thermoform paddle is the big step forward you're going to get in terms of power and spin. But if you want to sacrifice the least control in doing so, the Perseus is a perfect hybrid paddle. The CRBN1X Power is the most powerful 16mm paddle we carry, potentially the most powerful on the market, and it's right up there in terms of spin with the V7. If you want to crank those two characteristics up to the max, and you're not too worried about softness and control, it's the perfect paddle for you. The V7 is obviously the best value for money paddle on this list. It's quite a bit less expensive than the other two, and while you will be making a slight sacrifice in sweet spot size, it's still a fantastic option, and I don't see any other paddles on the market right now that are better value than the V7. Can anybody tell me why it's called the V7? It feels like the V1 to me. Oh, it's probably going to have something to do with the amount of prototypes they developed. That would make sense. If I'm right about that, I'm a genius. Look, I really enjoyed taking a deeper dive into the subtle but important differences between these three paddles. I've been wanting to do a video like this ever since I touched my first thermoform paddle, and I'm really glad to have finally gotten around to it. Hopefully I was able to help shed some light. We are still waiting on our Legacy 6.0 and Electrum orders to come in, so I am still planning to do a full-on thermoform paddle comparison when they do come in. Maybe it'll be more of like a tier list style video, I'm not quite sure yet. But that's it from us this week. I really do hope I'm back on court as soon as possible. Also, remember that you can visit us in store if you want to demo any of these paddles, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.